All right, well, we've made it to part four, our final session in this series of the arrest and trials of Jesus. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I've sure enjoyed it. Once again, back in the garage, and we'll do the fifth and sixth trial here, and then I have a story at the end for us that I think you might find a little bit interesting. Today we're going to be in Luke and then a little bit in Matthew. Last time I mentioned the this idea of the harmony of the Gospels, and just in case, most of you I hope nodded with me when I mentioned that. But in case you don't understand what that is, it's simply this: there's people that would look at the four Gospels and say, well, this one says Jesus went from Nazareth to Capernaum, and then to somewhere else. And this gospel says Jesus went from Nazareth to the somewhere else, and go to and doesn't mention Capernaum, and they would impose contradictions on that, and that's not the truth. The reality is this: let's just say, for whatever reason, myself and my wife Dana and my two girls, Lena and Tessa, we go hiking in the woods. And I ask the three of them when we're all done to simply journal it, write down an account. And they would all write about the car ride there. They would all write about the funny jokes I told in the car and how they laughed and and the time just flew by so fast. They would talk about getting our backpacks on and getting our waters filled up and all ready to go, and then starting to hike, but we would tend to spread out. And then I go over here to this particular rock, and Lena and I climb up and over that. And Dana and Tessa aren't there. They're further down the trail. So in Lena's journal, she's going to write about that incident, and it would be missing from the other two journals because they weren't there. It's not that it didn't happen. It's just Lena's doing her account, what she knows to be true. She's not just going to make something up. And then there's going to be times where Dana and I are doing something where we're standing there watching the girls. And what you find then in the harmony of the Gospels is not the contradictions that stand out. What you find is when you put them all side by side and start to line everything up, yes, some miss things here and some miss things there. But what's amazing is four separate authors written at different times. And what's truly amazing is how well they harmonize and line up so perfectly together. And with the four different accounts, we have a pretty decent timeline of where Jesus went and what he did and stuff like that. So that's this idea of the harmony of the gospel. So when we have to jump around and in Luke, it says he went from here to there and totally skipped something. It's because Luke didn't follow Jesus. The disciples are scattered. Okay, so fine, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not like they are chained to Jesus and going with them. Peter's with them over here, and then Peter stays back when he's carted off to here, and then Luke happens to be there, and then Matthew happens. So that's this idea of harmony of the Gospels, and that's why we kind of need to bounce around to get the full picture. So that's if you learn something new, fantastic. If you already knew that, fantastic. So here we go. We finished up last time with he was before Pilate. Pilate does this. The four steps of the procedure of the Roman Code of Conduct. And he, I guess maybe I didn't even mention it last time. The fourth step or the last step. Well, sorry. Let me back up. The first step is accusation, then interrogation, then defense, and then a verdict. And Pilate finds no guilt, and that's the verdict that's laid. He finds that there's the spiritual kingdom. It's not going to affect or threaten Rome. Jesus is not guilty of treason. He's thinking Jesus is off in La La Land, talking about something that is not going to come back to me. And it's clear to Pilate that Jesus isn't trying to overthrow the government because Jesus' followers aren't there to fight for him. You can't say, yeah, this guy and his followers, or this guy is trying to overthrow the government, if it's not actually happening. That's a pretty big evidence that is severely lacking. So Pilate officially announces the verdict that he finds no guilt. That's going to sort of change. He's not actually going to change his mind, but he's going to succumb to pressures. So, and we're going to find that in the 6th trial. But in the meantime, he hears that he is from Galilee. So we are in Luke chapter 23 to start off today. And in verse 6, it says, when Pilate heard that heard this, where they said in verse 5, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. When Pilate heard it, verse 6, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belongs to Herod, so they said yes, apparently. So he learns that Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction. He sent him to Herod. It wasn't like sending him all the way up to Galilee or whoever Herod ruled from to rule over the area of Galilee. Herod's in town. He's in his whatever quarters down the street around the corner, where Herod's not a whole long ways away. And so he sends him to Herod. Herod was Pilate's lifelong enemy up until this event, interestingly. Herod, who knows if you know. Herod's the one who beheaded John the Baptist. He's the one who dealt with vicious cruelty over his subjects. Now, Herod looked upon Jesus as a magician, and he had been anxious to see Jesus do a trick. So, verse 8, Luke 23, verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign, that's a trick, some sign performed by him. So, in this, well, let's just keep reading. And he questioned him at some length. But he, Jesus, answered him nothing. Jesus knows what's going on here. You don't see him respond to Herod in any way. This was not any actual court proceeding. This is silliness. All Herod wanted was a game. He wanted a jester for his court. He wanted a clown. When Jesus wouldn't cooperate, we read that they mocked him as a king. So Herod's does it matter if he's mean or not? I don't know. But he's just straight up mean here. He's disingenuous. He's just making a mockery of this whole thing. He's and Jesus, obviously Jesus knows this, and he's not going to play along. He doesn't have to speak. Herod's not asking him if he is the Jewish Messiah, so he knows he doesn't have to speak. He's not going to give him the time of day. He's not going to. He's just not going to respond. He's not going to give Herod anything that Herod wants. Verse 10, and the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, so they followed him down. They followed this proceeding down. Were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. So the people outside, or wherever the chief priests and everybody else, wherever they're standing, um, whether they entered or not, I guess they probably wouldn't have, but um, they're screaming. It's exciting. There's a lot of energy going on, and Herod just plays into their deal and um, picks on Jesus a little more, dresses him up as a king, and sends it. He says, it's like, I picture it where Herod is smiling and trying to have a good time and pick on him and thinking like he's the life of the party and whatever. And when he doesn't get what he wants, he just changes instantly. You know what? Get him out of here. Send him back to Pilate. I don't think Herod went away feeling really good about all this. So, very, very simply, that's the fifth trial. Nothing actually occurred, but it's something before another leader. So, Pilate, it's still morning. None of this took a whole long time. This has all happened kind of rapid speed, because everybody's I guess I'd think of it like the chief priests and scribes. They don't want the momentum to die. They want to keep the ball rolling. They want to get this going. So they're pushing it right along. There's not a whole lot of delays. So back at the palace, Pilate's probably eating breakfast, thinking, "Wow, that's over." And then he looks out his window, and here comes Jesus. He's still bound, but now he's robed as a king. And it's like, oh, I thought I was done with that. And here he comes. And yeah, it's obvious that Herod didn't get very far and wasn't helping the situation. He wasn't going to just dismiss this. He sends it back to Pilate. It brought together, it says in verse 12, now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for they had been enemies with each other. So it somehow brought them together as friends. So Pilate didn't want to declare him guilty. He tries a couple of things to do to get out of having to pronounce Jesus as guilty and have there be another crucifixion on his record. He wants this to just kind of go away, so there's no record that gets back to Caesar. It looks like, well, there's Pilate again having more problems. So he tries this thing with Barabbas that you're familiar with. So let's look at in Matthew 27. Is it Matthew 27:15? Matthew 27:15. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So who's Barabbas? Well, he's a murderer. He's an insurrectionist. He was guilty of sedition. And he was bound in prison awaiting death by crucifixion. It was a capital crime he had committed. He was the one guilty of treason. So Pilate's thinking, if I can bring Barabbas out and set him next to Jesus, Jesus will look good by comparison. And the people will say, oh no, let's give us, go ahead and give us Jesus, not this terrible Barabbas that we all know about. We know who he is. We know what he's committed, which he was the person that was very. You look at the list of who Barabbas was. That's who they were accusing Jesus of, and Jesus is innocent. Barabbas is the guilty one of those same things. But they weren't having it. It says the people were just stirred up and just shouting, "Crucify him!" and all that. So it backfires. It backfires on Pilate. Let's look at John 19. So Pilate releases Barabbas to them. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And this scourging, this is kind of a big deal. And if you want to know what kind of a deal it was, you have to look at the motivation here. And basically, the scourging would be an intense beating. There's this thing, the cat of nine tails, is this whip with all the leather strips, and they would sew animal bones and teeth and whatever into it, and they would whip the guy, and it would wrap around his torso, and then they'd pull, and it would just shred and rip open. And he does this. Here's how bad it was. We don't have that great of an idea, simply because we've never witnessed this firsthand. This isn't CGI. This isn't Hollywood. This isn't special effects. This would have been real. And here's what Pilate's trying to do. The Barabbas thing didn't work, so he goes and he takes Jesus back, and he says to the guys, the Romans, the soldiers, whatever, he still wants to get out of this. He hasn't succumbed to the shouts for crucifying him just yet, and this is his last ditch effort. He knows it's the last thing, so he says we don't see this written, but this is this is what's going on here. He tells the guards, take him within an inch of his life. When we bring him back out, I want these people to either be silenced or sickened and just leave. This is my last chance. So it's that bad. However bad that needs to be to absolutely silence a mob. That's what Pilate is going for. So he has him scourged. They do the crown of thorns, the purple robe on him. I've seen some different studies and whatever, the thorns that they would use. There are thorns out there from different trees that are so hard. The way it's wood, but the thorn itself is such a hard, dense wood that it can pierce a human skull. It's has an incredible tensile strength. So they make this crown of thorns and squish it on his head. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps in the face. Verse 4, John 19, verse 4. Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And he's doing like this presentation thing of, here's how destroyed this person is. You don't need to do any more. It didn't work. this backfires on him as well, just like with Barabbas. So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered in the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Now Jesus speaks up. Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out again, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar." This is just political pandering. This is shaming Pilate. It's like peer pressure. This is like the teenagers at the party trying to get the one guy to do something really stupid. You're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, and this you couldn't pay them to say this. The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." They didn't believe that. They hated Caesar. They hated Rome. But they're playing into Pilate. They're getting Pilate as riled up as they were, and this is what they were doing with the crowd. So he handed him over to them to be crucified. And that's the end of the final trial, of all 6 trials. It's a pretty intense story. It's a big deal. In conclusion, I have a story for you. I said it at the beginning. It says at the end there that they spit on him, struck him in the head. You and I deserve that spit. We deserve the nails in his hands and his feet. It's our sin. It's the penalty he bore. It's our penalty, not his. We are the guilty ones. We are like sheep gone astray. Turn to our own ways. This is a true story. This is about a minister. It says this: a minister of God didn't have anyone to work with, so he asked God to make him available to whatever would be his will. He checked the want ads because he needed some money, and he saw there was a bus driving job made available to him. So he worked as a bus driver in South Chicago. If you know anything about Chicago, I do. I went to school there. It's not South Chicago, and this is true. It's not South Chicago that you want to drive a bus in, but that's where they had the need. He found out later it was because nobody else would stay on the job, so he drove it. Before a week passed, some thugs got on the bus and didn't pay. They sat in the back, sneered and jeered and mocked him. The next day, the same thing happened. The third day it happened again. After it went on for about a week, he decided he didn't have to put up with that. So he decided to call an officer inside the bus and make them pay. He saw one down about a block, and after he got on, he told the officer that the fellows back there haven't paid for several days. Would you at least make them pay today? And he did, but unfortunately the officer got off the bus. When the door was closed, the bus driver drove a little further and turned a corner. And that was the last thing he remembered. They knocked a couple of teeth out of his head, they stole his money, and when he woke up, the bus was empty. He sat there in confusion and disillusionment, wondering, what kind of ministry is this, Lord? I told you I was available, and this was the job you opened up? And he went home, turned the bus in, took the rest of the day off. He stared up at the ceiling as he was nursing his wounds, and he thought, I'm not going to let them get away with that. So through an interesting chain of events, they rounded up, with the help of some officers, the very fellows, and took them to court, all 4 of them. The day of the hearing, he stood before the court, and the judge listened carefully and decided the fellows were guilty. And they didn't have any money to buy their way out, so they had to spend some time in jail. Suddenly the minister realized, here's my chance. He said, Your Honor, may I speak for a few moments? The judge said, yes, you may. The minister said, I'd like for you to tally up all of the time these fellows together would be spending in jail. And I'd like to go on their behalf. And the judge responded, well, that's highly irregular. It has never been done before. And the minister responded, oh, yes, it has, about 2,000 years ago. And then in about 4 minutes, he gave them the gospel. 3 of the young men came to know Christ on the spot. One of them later, after the minister was incarcerated, they went through with it. The minister was actually put in jail. That fellow was having a ministry with those 4 guys who heard the message that somebody else wanted to pay the price for their sin. A living testimony of what Jesus did for us. And that's what we find with the trials of Jesus, and ultimately the crucifixion. We see what Jesus actually did by paying the penalty for our sin on the cross. Pretty amazing deal. As we go through this Easter season, I pray that you would be cognizant of that you would apply that to your own self, and realize just what you've done in your life, and just what, much more importantly, what you have been forgiven for. Let me pray, and we'll close out this series. Heavenly Father, thanks so much for the opportunity to teach and share and study and read your word. Thanks for your word being available to us. And Lord, I pray that whoever and whenever folks are listening to this, that they would know the truth of your love, what your Son did on the cross in being obedient to you all the way through. And Lord, that they would know exactly where they stand, and if they need to repent, Lord, that you would draw them to repentance. And Lord, they can know your gift of salvation fully and truly. Thanks, God. We love you so much. Amen. This has been great. We'll see what comes up next, but hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining me.